A couple of statistics that I just read recently. According to George Barna, you guys know who George Barna is? Barna does all kinds of statistical analysis, especially for Christians. And George Barna's research says that in the United States, there are probably 2 million people, just based on the percentages that he calculated, about 2 million people who would say that reading the book, The Da Vinci Code, has significantly changed their religious beliefs. 2 million people. I read a survey in England that says 53% of the people in England who have read the book now say they're more likely to believe that Jesus was married and had children than they were before they read the book. So, for people who would say that, well, it's just fiction and why are we making a big deal over this? It's not just fiction. I would say it is fiction, but it's not just fiction. It's having a discernible moral influence in our world and in our society. And so it's important for us to think very carefully about how it is we should respond to the book and the movie and other attacks against the Christian faith. What is a Christian response? So let's list some of these on the board. What are some different ways you have heard people suggest we respond to the Da Vinci Code? Ignore it. There's one right there. Okay. Some people say just ignore it and it will go away. All right. It's not true, but let's keep listing. What are some other ways that people have chosen to respond?
Read the Bible as well.
Okay. Read it, but read the Bible as well. Okay. What else?
Read history books. Real history books.
Yeah, there you go. Read some history. Maybe. But history is so, for most of us, we did not have positive experiences in history class. Am I right about that? For most of us, what's weird is when you think about what history is these great stories that involve killing and swords and, just all nobility and all that kind of stuff. And yet you go in the average high school history class and look, and if you were to tell a high school boy especially, I'm going to tell you a story about swords and knives and guns. You think that you get them all excited, but history teachers have the unique ability. I hope there are no history teachers here, because no offense. History teachers have the unique ability to take these great, fascinating stories and turn them into just dates and dead people. Facts and figures and dates and dead people. But so you ought to read history. You ought to read the Bible. What are some other responses that you've heard Christians say, this is what we ought to do in light of the Da Vinci Code?
If you read it, it can cause you to doubt.
And so, you should stay away from it. Stay away. Because, and it's true, I've heard people say this. My brother-in-law read that book and now he's not a Christian anymore, and so don't you read it either because it'll make you not a Christian either. So some people say stay away from it. So, and some people have said, in fact, the Catholic Church has made an official statement that they ought to boycott it. We ought to boycott the movie. So there's one right there, boycott. What's some other responses? Yeah. Yeah, in fact, the Philippines is voting to try to ban it, right? So those are different responses. I read an article in Christianity Today this week that said we ought to other-cot it. Did anybody else read that article? That everybody ought to go to the movies this weekend, but go see something else. And that'll show them. So some people say ignore it. Some people say boycott it, other-cot it, ban it. Embrace it. Some people say you should embrace it, whatever, Let me ask you this. What is it specifically about any of the responses that we have listed, any of the responses you've heard talked about, what is it specifically about those responses that make them Christian responses? Anything in particular that strikes you as particularly Christian about boycotting it, or embracing it, or ignoring it? See, we have tendency to go to extremes. That's just our tendency. I think part of it is because if you will put your back into a corner, if you will do that yourself, nobody can sneak up on you. And you can see them coming. And so we tend to extremes. Let's never see it, and let's pick it out in front of it, or let's do all kinds of stuff. We go to these great extremes. And I've heard some people call Dan Brown the devil. I've heard that, and I've heard other people say, no, we ought to be thanking Dan Brown because he's opened up this great opportunity. He's also opened up a can of worms and thrown dirt in our face while he did it, but we ought to say, thank you, sir, may I have another? So you hear these great responses, but for the most part, they're extreme responses. So what is it about any of these responses that makes them particularly and uniquely Christian? Anything?
People are trying to protect what they believe.
So let's pick up on that. So some people say we ought to protect and defend our faith. Okay? But is that a uniquely Christian posture? No, because Arabs want to protect and believe what they believe too, and so do Buddhists, and so do all these. So what is it that would characterize a response as being uniquely Christian? Well, let's think about this a little bit further. What does that mean? Exactly, that's what being a Christian is a Christian, a little Christ, literally is what it means, so a small Christ, or one seeking to imitate and follow Christ. So really a Christian response would be a Christ-like response, right? So that's what would make a response uniquely Christian if it could look like the way Jesus would respond. So how would Jesus respond? So really when we say what's a Christian response, what we're really asking is WWJDWDB. What would Jesus do with Dan Brown? That's really what we're asking, right? What would Jesus do with Dan Brown? Well, okay, let's start by looking at what Jesus did with us. So, open your Bible to the first chapter of the Gospel of John. John chapter 1. Now, first of all, just so you know here, and you can use this, I'm sure, at some point in time. Next time somebody comes to you and says, well, Jesus wasn't even considered deity until 300 years after he was dead, Constantine, Council of Nicaea, and all that kind of stuff, because that's in the book, you can take them right here to the first verse of the Gospel of John, and you can say, well, clearly, the guy who wrote this believed that, and he lived before Constantine. In the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. That's a pretty clear statement. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, but the darkness has not understood it. Now skip down to verse 14. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We've seen his glory, the glory of the one and only, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. Okay? So when Jesus engaged our world, he did so with two things in either hand. On the one hand, he had what? Grace. And on the other hand, he had what? Truth. Now, if you think about it, our responses tend to be extreme versions of one or the other. Either all grace, hey, let's just all get along here. Hey, Dan Brown says he's a Christian, so let's give him the benefit of the doubt. And who's to say that you know what's right, and maybe he knows things that you don't know, and let's just all be affirming and graceful, okay? So that's one extreme. But then the other extreme is, let's pick up a Bible and let's throw it at it. Now, I'll beat you over the head with the Word of God. And the truth can become a weapon. Now, let me just ask you this. In our fellowship, given our particular baggage, which of those two extremes do we tend to skew towards? Truth. We are not, it was a long time coming before we could even talk about grace, without feeling like, oh, I got to apologize now. And we always have to apologize for it too. Now, I'm not saying, you remember you'd hear sermons about grace where we'd always have to say, well, no, I'm not saying. I got in trouble for preaching grace, and that's one of the reasons why I don't preach for a living anymore. But there was a little woman in the church where I served in Texas, and her name was Donna. And Donna is probably 86 years old now. And Donna told me one time, if you don't get in trouble, you're not pushing hard enough. Because it happened to Jesus, it happened to Paul, it happened to Martin Luther, you're in good company, okay? So we tend to really skew more towards truth than towards grace. And that's just, I think that's just a product of our heritage. And so when we talk about this, we have to remember a couple of things. Truth is heavy. I mean, truth is weighty. It carries a weight, and it has a force. It's like a scalpel, you know. Truth can be used for great, tremendous good, but a scalpel in the hands of a 4-year-old can also do tremendous amounts of damage. And so truth, in fact, there's a proverb about how truth in the mouth of a fool is like a thorn in your hand. You know, I mean, it can do tremendous damage if you're not careful, if you don't use discernment and wisdom. And I think Jesus comes and he balances both perfectly. And notice the sequence of the words. Which do they mention first? Grace first, and then truth. I think it's very important that we get the sequence of that correct, because a lot of times truth with no grace ends up pushing people farther away from God than when they started, because it's not told in the context of love and grace. And the Pharisees, I mean, who were the people in Jesus' life who had cornered the market on truth? It was the Pharisees. But they had no room for grace whatsoever. It wasn't the truth that Jesus told that got him in trouble. It was the grace that he showed. That's what really got him in trouble with them. And so they practiced what some theologians have called a strategy of isolation. Because they thought, well, we have the truth over here, and we had to protect this truth. And the best way to protect this truth is to keep it out of the hands of people like you. So we've got the truth, we've got it all locked up over here, and we're not going to have anything to do with you. Here's the only way we'll ever engage you. We'll run in and we'll hit you with the truth really hard and then we'll run away. And that was their evangelism tactic. Okay? Very difficult to recruit new Pharisees, by the way. Not many people respond well to that kind of evangelistic strategy. And yet, hello, churches all over the world, that's their only strategy. How are you going to bring in new disciples? We'll walk in and we'll hit them with the truth as hard as we can. And then we'll withdraw from them. That's not attractive. That's not how Jesus came. Could you imagine if Jesus practiced that way? We'd all have been thumped and then wondering what happened. Instead, Jesus came full of truth. I mean, he said hard things. He did not pull his punches. He once told a guy, listen, if you want to follow me, go sell everything you've got. Go ahead, I'll wait. He told people, if you really want to follow me, you deny yourself and you pick up a cross and you come with me. Well, can you guarantee? I can't guarantee you anything except that in this world you're going to have trouble. That's the only guarantee you got. And if you want to be great, by the way, you want to be the greatest in the kingdom, this is how you do it. You humble yourself and you serve other people. And by the way, if somebody hits you on one side, you turn the other cheek. And those people who hate you, pray for them and love them. What? He told us hard truths. But he always did it what did he do first? Before he taught one lesson, what did he do? Before he prayed, before he spoke a word, what did he do? He was born, right? Duh. I mean, before he taught one thing, before he modeled one thing, he was born. And think this through, because the incarnation has caused more controversy and stirred up more trouble, more heresy surrounds the incarnation than any other doctrine in the Bible. Because people seem to be able to believe that Jesus was God, but not that he was a real person. Or they can believe he was a real person, but not that he was God. And again, in our fellowship, I think we have tended towards believing more that he was God and not a real person We talked about this a couple of weeks ago. Every December, we sing the same song. The cattle are lowing, the baby awakes, but little Lord Jesus, no crying he makes. We have such a hard time believing that Jesus cried when he was a baby. We're okay with him crying when he's an adult, but not as a baby for some reason. I don't know what that is. But we have a hard time believing that Jesus was a real flesh and blood baby, dependent upon a teenager. He could have been stepped on. He was a baby. He was vulnerable, and he couldn't speak. He wasn't pretending not to speak. Sitting in there muttering to himself, to whom shall I give the theory of relativity? Shall I give that to Einstein or Newton? Oh, here comes the woman. I should probably pretend like I don't know any words. So, goo goo gaga, He wasn't pretending. He really couldn't speak. The one verse we have about when Jesus was growing up says that Jesus grew in wisdom. What does that imply? There was a time when he didn't have all the wisdom. He had to grow in it. That he learned obedience, the writer of Hebrews says. So Jesus clearly was human. He was also divine, but he was human. And over and over again, we see God taking an initiative to build a bridge to us. That's what we've seen over and over again through the Old Testament. As we've walked through the Old Testament, how many times do the people get together and say, you know what? We are just so far away from God. We should go looking for him. Has that ever happened in the Old Testament? We've been doing this for a year and a half. Have you heard that story one time? No. What happens? God says, you people are so far away from me, I will come down there. Hey, what's going on? And God gets involved in our stuff, even when we've run far, far away from him. The only time we ever run back to him is when we get in trouble. That's the only time. We never just go, I haven't talked to God in a while. I'll talk to God. No, it's usually when we're in trouble that we notice the big gap. There's a huge gap between God and people. And you all know this. And over again throughout the Bible, the consistent record shows God taking the initiative to build a bridge to us. Why? Because he knows there's no way in the world we can build a bridge to him. Only God can do that. God has to build a bridge from where he is to where we are, because we cannot be trusted to build a bridge from where we are to where he is. We'd break it, we'd tear it down, or we'd do something crazy, we'd do something reckless, and we're unable to do it. Now, we've talked now about two different things, but they're very key to the Christian faith. On the one hand, we've talked about the incarnation. On the other hand, we've talked about who takes the initiative in establishing a relationship between humans and God. And clear record of Scripture is God always takes that initiative. Okay? God builds the bridge to us because we cannot build the bridge to him. Interestingly enough, in the New Testament, did you know there are only two doctrines over which we are told to divide fellowship? You know what those two are? The incarnation and who takes the initiative in salvation. That's it. If you add works to grace for salvation, anybody who teaches that gospel, Paul says, should be cursed. That's pretty strong language. It's in Galatians. Read it yourself. I didn't write it. It's in there. It's Galatians. Says, if you add works to grace for salvation, you've nullified the whole thing. On the other hand, anybody who denies that Jesus came in the flesh and that he was one with the Father, I can have no fellowship with him. That's most of John's writings. The Gospel of John, 1 John, the book of Revelation. Those are the only two doctrines in the whole New Testament we're told you can divide over. And what do? But that's not what this class is about. So, we'll talk about that some other time. See, God is doing what? What is God up to? Big picture. He's building a community, right? Building a community, that's his great dream. Build a community of people who are rightly related to him and rightly related to each other. And the only way to do that is by building a bridge to us and then introducing a code of conduct. He doesn't introduce a code of conduct and say, if you will follow these rules, then you will become my people. Even the Ten Commandments, you go back and read the Ten Commandments. God says, because you are my people, here, live like this. So many of Paul's letters, the book of Ephesians, you have been called and redeemed, now live like it. Not live a certain way so that you can become called and redeemed, but because you have been brought into this wonderful relationship. Because I have built a bridge, now this bridge can sustain the weight of truth I'm about to lay on you. But you can't build it the other way around. Grace first, then truth. God gives us grace so we can obey the truth. In fact, I want you to see this for yourself. Turn to Titus chapter 2. So that you'll know that I'm not making this up. Titus chapter 2. Look at verse 11. For the grace of God that brings salvation has appeared to all men. It teaches us to say. What teaches us to say? Well, no, what teaches? Grace. The grace of God is what teaches us. The grace of God teaches us to say no to ungodliness and worldly passions and to live self-controlled, upright, and godly lives in this present age. In other words, what comes first? Grace or obedience? Grace must come first, because without grace, you can't obey. So anyone who says you have to obey so you can receive grace isn't reading the same Bible I'm reading. You receive grace so that you can obey. All right? Grace first, then truth, in that order. So, okay. Now you look at Jesus and the way Jesus dealt with us. When Jesus came, he didn't just come to a specific group of people. He came to insiders, like Nicodemus in John chapter 3. You know Nicodemus? Nicodemus was a member of the Sanhedrin. He was a Pharisee. He was a member of the aristocracy, the ruling class. He was as high society as you could get in that time. But then, the very next chapter, who do we find him talking to? A Samaritan woman in John chapter 4. She's a Samaritan, and she's a woman, and she's a multiple divorced person. She's as low on the social status as you can get. So he comes to the insiders and the outsiders, the uppers and the lowers. He comes to people who are looking for the Messiah, like Nathanael in John chapter 1, and he comes to people who have no idea what the Messiah is, like the Roman centurion. He comes to everybody and offers them the life that he has to give. So he comes to absolutely everybody. But before he taught, and so all of that before he teaches one word. And the way Jesus structures his teaching is couched in the bigger picture that is his life. We tend to take his teaching out of the context of the way he lived, the fact that he lived. Now, we read at the beginning of John chapter 1 that Jesus was from the beginning, existed from the very beginning, before the beginning, in fact. And that second paragraph in John chapter 1 says that he made everything. That there's nothing that has been made that was made without him. So, it's a little bit difficult for us to get our minds around this, but think this through. Jesus lived before he lived. Like, you understand what I mean by that? I mean, his birth wasn't the beginning of his existence. He lived before he was born. And what kind of life did he live? He was divine and had all of the attributes of deity that come attached with that, right? He created everything. The book of Colossians, chapter 1, 16 and 17 says that everything was created by him and for him. And so imagine the kind of life Jesus lived before he was born. He's got no limitations. He's omniscient, so he knows everything. He's omnipresent. He can be in multiple places at one time. He's omnipotent. He can do anything. He's got all the power, all the authority, all the glory, all the everything that you could ever want. He's got it. Sitting around the throne room of heaven, angels are worshiping him. It's climate controlled. I mean, just imagine in your own mind, like, what's the cushiest place you've ever been? I mean, have you ever, some of you ladies, you've been to like Spa Sidel or someplace like that? Is that what you were just thinking, some of you have been to places like that, or some of you have been, a tropical vacation. What's the most comfortable place you've ever been in your life? Can you remember that? Can you put yourself back there for just a minute? Like the most relaxing place, soothing music in the background, and people there to wait on you hand and foot. What can I bring you? Can I get you an umbrella for that? Or whatever. I mean, just like the most comfortable, cushy place you've ever been. Okay? You got something like that in your mind? I'd label that place A. All right? Now, when I was a kid, I grew up in Southern California, and about 70 miles inland from where we lived was a lot of dairy land and dairy farms. And every year, my elementary school would take a field trip to a dairy farm. Anybody ever do that? You go out on a dairy farm? Some of you may have, I don't know if you grew up there or spent summers there or something like that. You ever been to a dairy farm? It's not a real clean place. Dairy farms are not clean. They're not, cleanliness is not, if any of you are dairy farmers, I'm not, no offense, but you got to watch where you step, I mean, it's just, it's a dirty place. And if you've ever been, have you ever seen a cattle trough? What that really looks like, and it's all, especially those, they used to make them out of wood, and when they've been licked so much, they're smooth and shiny, I mean, that's kind of gross. They smell kind of sour and flies everywhere. And the fact, if in your own mind, if you're staring at the cattle trough, you've probably stepped in it already, because they do that where they're eating. I mean, that's just the circle of life as far as cows are concerned. Not a real clean place. All right, now, you got that in your mind? Label that place B. And think this through. Because Jesus goes from one extreme to the next in a heartbeat. He goes from eternity, the throne room of heaven, where he has access to all the resources of godliness because he is in fact deity. He goes from there to a cattle trough in a heartbeat. And when you bring those two together, label that place C and call it Christmas, because that is the incarnation. Jesus could have stayed where he was. Look at those people down there. Somebody needs to go down there and tell them the truth. But he said, before we tell them the truth, somebody needs to build a bridge so that when they realize they're on the wrong side of this gap, they'll be able to come across it. You see? And that's what the incarnation is. And that's how Jesus has approached us. Paul in Romans 5 says, while we were still enemies, he came, and he lived, and he taught, and he died for us. While we were enemies. People look at Dan Brown and they say, he's the devil. And you know what? Jesus died for him too. The executives at Sony Pictures and Ron Howard and Tom Hanks and all those people, Jesus died for them. Jesus builds a bridge before he tells us anything. When God wanted to talk to us about ultimate things, he didn't use golden tablets. He did not use great prophets or burning bushes. He'd used all that in the past. But when he really wanted to talk to us about the one thing that matters more than anything else ever will, he used a person. He built a bridge. And Jesus entered into relationships with people who were completely ignorant of who he was and what he'd come to do and how to make their lives better. And that's what he calls us to do as well. Build bridges. And if you think about just being born, And that's not a very noble way of entering the world. I mean, we've had 3 kids, and it's not a real, even in hospitals. Our last one was born at Northside Hospital, and it's known as a baby factory. I mean, there are more babies born there than just about anywhere in the Southeast. And they have great technology. Our first one was born up at Greater Baltimore Medical Center in Towson, Maryland, and that's internationally known. They have the best neonatal care in the country up there. And yet, it's still, it's an ugly process. There's mucus and blood and sweat and tears, and that's just the dads. It's not a pleasant experience. And so if you think you strip away all the modern technology and all the nice stuff, that's what Jesus endured. All of that same process without any of the modern technology and bright lights and sterile cloths and stuff like that. And he endured that. Why? Why would God, who's sitting here in point A, say, I'm willing to go through everything that comes with the package of point B? Why in the world would he do that? Because he knew. There's no way they're going to be able to build a bridge from their end up here. If there's ever going to be anything, what's he up to? He's building a community. In order for that to happen, somebody's got to build a bridge, and it's not going to be them. So God takes the initiative on himself. God, don't you understand what that's going to cost? I understand. Don't you know how hard that's going to be? I understand. Don't you know how undignified that looks? I know. Don't you know how... I know. Trust me, I know. I've taken it all into account, and I'm willing to do it because my great dream is to build a community here. And in order for that to happen, I have to engage them in a relationship. And in the context of our relationship, I put boundaries in place. So I didn't marry my wife because she kept the rules. And she didn't marry me because I kept the rules. I keep the rules because I'm married to her. You understand? There's a sequence there. Because she was willing to enter into a covenant relationship with me, that's why we respect each other. Not the other way around. Same thing with our relationship with God. So Jesus, in that one moment, goes from the most comfortable, most beautiful place you've ever imagined to the grimiest, germiest place on earth. And he did that before he spoke one word. He brought us grace. And without grace, there is no salvation. Without grace, there is no hope. Without grace, there is nothing beyond the grave except misery and punishment to the full extent of human depravity without restraint. That's where we were headed. And while we were headed down that path, Jesus built a bridge so that we could return. He became like us so that we could become like him. But he doesn't just build this bridge and say, all right, y'all come. He says, whoa, wait a second. Before you come, and you're all welcome. Okay, everybody's welcome. Let me tell you, this is how we do things in my house. Okay? Now, you're welcome to come to my house. And anybody who wants to can come. Once we get in the house, this is what it's going to be like. So some of you may not like it in the house, and that's okay too. So if you want to stay outside, that's your choice. We're all going in. When we go in, this is what it's going to be like. He introduces truth in the context of grace. One time Jesus yelled at people because they perverted the truth of his message. And Jesus was often critical of how little faith his followers seemed to display. Even after they'd witnessed these great miracles. And he'd yell at them. He'd get mad at them. Jesus got angry. That's okay. It's okay to say that. Turned over tables and chased people out of the temple. I mean, he was a passionate guy. And he did not flinch. Sometimes he would tell people, listen, if you don't change your ways, your way of thinking and your way of doing things, if you don't change, you're going to end up separated from your Father forever. And he didn't pull his punches on stuff like that. I mean, he told people hard truth. And that needs to be our model as well. Once we have built a bridge of a relationship, we cannot be trivial when it comes to matters of truth. We cannot be wishy-washy. We cannot be, waffling on matters of eternal destiny because the stakes are too high. Jesus came and he built these relational bridges. And after he was done, he spoke hard, heavy truth to people. And he just laid it out there for them. When he tells the guy, you need to go sell everything you've got and give it to the poor and then come back and follow me, he just sets it on the table and he says, there it is. What are you going to do with it? And you remember what happens in the story? The guy goes away. And Jesus runs after him and says, wait a second, did I say everything? Let's just start with 10%. No, he doesn't do that. That's what I would do. That's what churches do. We're so anxious about trying to keep everybody in the pen. People will write letters. You know this. People will write letters to the elders. If you don't stop doing this, I'm going to leave. And most elders cave. Please don't leave. Please don't leave. Jesus puts it on the table and says, there it is. If you want to come on, let's go. And if you want to go ahead. If you want to leave, that's fine too. I mean, I'm here. I built this bridge. I've issued an invitation. I've told you what the rules of the house are going to be. Now, make your choice. You go through the Gospels sometime and you look at the way Jesus used questions to knock people off the fence. Who do you say I am? You think the response took him by surprise? Hey, what were you guys talking about? Jesus knew what they were talking about. Hey, why don't you go get your husband? Jesus uses these questions all the time. What's he doing? He's not looking for information. God comes to Adam in the garden. Adam, where are you? Does God not know where he is? God knows where he is. What's he trying to do? Get off the fence. I can see you. Come out from hiding. Choose one way or the other. Good teacher. Jesus stops him. Wait a second. Why do you call me good? Nobody's good except God. What are you saying? You see, he uses these questions to probe and to knock people off the fence. He tells them hard truth, but he does it in the context of an accepting, loving relationship. The Apostle Paul tells us that the church ought to be characterized by people who speak the truth in love. It's interesting. The Greek verb there is actually, it could be translated truthing. Truthing in love. That's how we're supposed to live our lives. Not using the truth as a weapon to bash other people, but also not using grace as a way to avoid difficult conversations. And our efforts to introduce people to Jesus will never be effective if we don't first build the bridge and then follow through by telling them the truth. If we fail to respond to honest questions with honest answers, people will remain unconvinced. And that, it means a couple of things. It means a commitment, first of all, to personal integrity, and second of all, a commitment to what we'll call intellectual or academic integrity, okay? And this is just where we want to land. I want to talk a little bit about personal integrity. I think Christians have bluffed for too long, and the world is calling our bluff. We have pretended like Christians have it all together. How are you? Perfect, and getting more perfect every day. Yeah, in every way, inch by inch, little by little, all this kind of, I'm absolutely perfect because I'm a Christian. I don't have money problems. I don't have marital problems. My kids are perfect. My car always runs. It never runs out of gas. I always get the promotion. I have a corner office. I'm always on time with all my bills because I'm a Christian. Is it grand to be a Christian? And we put on our shiny faces and our Sunday clothes. We put on our Sunday faces that go with our Sunday clothes. And we march in here and we pretend like everything's fine. And we've bluffed for too long. And we've tried to give the impression that the church is always right about everything. And people have poked holes in that. And Dan Brown is capitalizing on that. Wait a second. See, do you think if the church had a long-standing history of affirming women, do you think Dan Brown's accusation that the church has suppressed women would be as popular and resonate with as many people as it does? The reason why people latch onto that is because, well, look at their history. And the sad truth is, we have done terrible things. We were there. Inquisitions, we were there. Witch hunts, we were there. It wasn't as big as Dan Brown makes it sound, but we were there. The Crusades, we did that. You say, well, that was long ago. That was so long ago. Can we talk about, okay, yeah, civil rights movement. We were there. You know who we were? Most of us? We were the ones sitting in the front of the bus. We were the ones with the fire hoses and the dogs. We were the ones who did nothing during the Holocaust or World War II, and the ones who said never again. And then in 1994, we did nothing while 800,000 Rwandans were executed in the span of about 90 days. And the church sat around and sang, "Isn't it great to be a Christian?" and built new buildings. And we didn't get involved. We did that. That was us. Guilty. And it's time for us to come clean on stuff like that. Now, we've also done tremendously great things. And you go to some of these third world countries and you pull all the Christians out and the lights will literally go out. Okay? We do more. I mean, you don't see great hospitals built in the name of Gnostic saints, because you don't see that. You don't see stuff like that, orphanages built in the names of atheists. Christians, as a general rule, have been the ones who have done great things, built institutions of higher learning and hospitals, and treated the poor and the oppressed. But if we're going to tell the truth, let's tell the whole truth about this, okay? Let's talk about the good we've done. Let's also talk about the bad we've done. And let's be honest about our own personal struggles. Because they're done. The world outside is done listening to us talk about how perfect we are. Because they see the statistics. They know that we had the same divorce rate, the same rate of alcoholism and substance abuse, the same rate of spousal abuse, the same rate of child, the same unhappiness, the same rate of gambling addiction, the same rate of... They know, okay? It's true. We are flawed people. And it's time for us to be honest about that. But again, if we're going to tell the truth, let's tell the whole truth. And let's remind them, by the way, these hospitals, these missions, you go down and you talk to the people who were victims of Hurricane Katrina and you ask them what the world would be like if there were no Christians. And then you go back to Sam Harris, who wrote that book that said the Christian faith shouldn't even be tolerated in our society. And you say, all right, this is what our society would look like then. Don't be afraid. Don't flinch about this stuff. The only reason we're ever afraid is because we're afraid somebody's going to bring up the Inquisition. Let's go at them with both, the good and the bad. And let's lay them side by side and say, I think, in the grand scheme of things, the historical record will show that the good done by Christians vastly outweighs the bad done by Christians. Was the bad bad? Yes. Was burning one witch too many? Yes. Was oppressing one African American person too many? Yes. Did we do that? Yes. But who marched right alongside? And where were those rallies held? In Selma and Montgomery and Birmingham. In churches. Who is leading the way when it comes to drinkable water in third world countries and raising the literacy rates among impoverished people? Christians are. Let's tell the truth. Let's tell the whole truth, and let's not shy away from it. But let's also make a commitment not just to personal integrity, but to intellectual integrity as well. And this is why I so appreciate whoever it was over here who said, maybe we ought to read a history book every once in a while. Because we're so disconnected from history that somebody like Dan Brown could come along and say, did you know that Constantine was a pagan, he wasn't baptized till he was on his deathbed, and he was too helpless to fight back and all that? And we don't know history, and so we go, well, I guess you're right. Pick up a history book and read it. Find out what you believe and why you believe it. And work hard at figuring out ways to communicate that to other people. See, most Christians, you ask them, why do you believe what you believe? And they've got two answers. Answer number one, Well, I was raised that way. Well, just because your mama told it to you doesn't mean it's true. Because I'll just tell you, your mama will lie to you. She will. My mom told me if you go outside with wet hair, you'll get a cold. Anybody's mother ever tell you that? It's not true. Cold is a virus. I remember when I found that out. I was like 15, and cold is a virus. It has nothing to do with wet hair. And I thought, my mom's been lying to me. My earth was shattered. Your mom will lie to you. Okay, so just because you were raised that way doesn't make it true. Lots of people were raised different ways doesn't make it true. So people either say, oh, well, I was raised that way, or people will say, you know why I believe it? Because I tried it and it worked for me. That's the other response people will give you. Now, I'll tell you, my father-in-law, years and years ago, before I married my wife, my father-in-law won the lottery in California. Went, bought a ticket at a liquor store, and won the lottery. $1 million. Pretty impressive. Retired. Every Friday, to this day, he goes to the exact same liquor store, and he plays the exact same numbers. You want to know why? Because he tried it once, and it worked for him. You know how many times it's worked for him since? 0. He's probably paid back the $1 million since then. People do crazy things because they tried it once and it worked for you. That's why gambling works. If you never won a slot machine, you would never play it. I did it once. Let's see, what did I do? I touched my elbow, and then I pulled my hat off and put it back on. So every time I play, I got to touch my elbow, pull my hat off, put it back on. Because I tried it once and it worked. People are crazy about that stuff. Listen, if that's all you've got, if your faith is resting on the fact that you tried it once and it worked, bless your heart. Read a book. There are plenty of reasons. Listen, faith is, to some extent, a leap. Okay? Requires a little bit of a leap. But it's not a leap in the dark. It's a leap based on good, solid, historical evidence. The Christian faith is based on historical events that can either be verified or not. There is an avalanche of historical documents that you can dig into. So when somebody says, why do you believe what you believe? You should be able to give them a reasoned response. You should be able to articulate what you believe and why you believe it in a way that makes sense to them. And if you can't do that, come talk to me. I'll give you a reading list. There are books out there. There are DVDs you can watch. There are plenty of reasons. We've got to make a commitment to personal integrity, being honest about who we are, where we've been, what we've done, what our baggage is, but also to being able to tell the truth to people about why there is good reason to believe what we believe. This Saturday and Sunday, you guys know who John Young is? John's in his class sometimes. John hosts a radio show on WNIV on Saturdays and Sundays, and this weekend I'm going to be one of his guests on the show. And we taped it the other day, and he asked me this question. He asked this question right here. He said, John, what would Jesus do with Dan Brown? And I thought about it. It's a great question. What would he do? What would Jesus say? And this is what I came up with. I thought, I bet Jesus would come up alongside Dan Brown and say, what's all the fuss about? And Dan Brown would say, are you the only one who hasn't heard? Heard about what? Oh, about all this book and all these happenings and all this crazy stuff that's going on. And Jesus would say, why don't you tell me about that? Oh, it's about Jesus and Mary Magdalene and who was Jesus? And he'd ask him questions. And he'd invite him into a relationship. And then at some point in time, he'd act as if the conversation was over. And Dan Brown would probably say, hey, could we have lunch? Because Jesus was such a winsome person that people were always inviting him to have lunch. Could we have lunch? And Jesus would say, sure. And he would say, by the way, I noticed you're a little bit slow to believe certain things. Would you mind if I tell you a story? I mean, you want to hear a story? I've got a story for you. Sure, tell me your story. And Jesus would start all the way back from the very beginning, from the writings of Moses. And he would explain to him through the writings of Moses and the prophets how the Messiah had to come and live a sinless life and teach us how to live as God's people, as citizens in God's kingdom, and die a sacrificial death and raise victorious from the grave. And right when Dan Brown's eyes started to open, Jesus would be gone. You know why I think Jesus would do that with Dan Brown? Because that's the way Jesus did it at the end of the Gospel of Luke with two of his disciples on the road to Emmaus. Because Jesus is always taking the initiative to engage us in relationship and in conversation. And then he uses questions to probe our thinking. And then he opens our eyes. And if you look at that text especially, he usually opens our eyes over a meal, over communion, over bread and wine, and simple elements. Jesus has responded to us with equal parts grace and truth. And that's how he calls us to respond to other people. Let's pray. God, you've been so gracious to us. You could have come and just thumped us, just whacked us with the truth. And we were so clueless. So many of us were lost, totally deluded. And yet, you're so kind and patient with us. You come and build bridges and then introduce truth. God, help us to take the initiative with others as you have taken the initiative with us. To build bridges of relationships that can sustain the weight of truth. And then help us to be bold in our speaking. To be ready to give an answer when people ask us why we believe what we believe. But to give that answer with respect and gentleness. May we respond to the world the way you have responded to us. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. We'll see you in a couple of weeks.